excess deaths, and cannibalism. And more recently, I'm more involved, more interested in explaining the regional variations within Moldova, which is a very fascinating topic, which obliged me to go to the files of the county party committees, party executives of the counties, and also at the level of the district party and executive committees. Let me start with main data on the Soviet famine. And let me state from the beginning that the climate factor is more important in the post-war famine than in the 1930s. It's about the drought of 40, let's say a bad weather year of 45 and the drought of 46, not only in Moldavia, but also in other basket grain areas of Soviet Union, Ukraine, except Western Siberia. A comparison with the in relation to the 1930s. Here we have another major factor, are the war consequences, and the fact that in 46 it's the start of the first 5-year post-war plan, which is very important in order to contextualize the post-war Soviet famine in general and in Soviet Moldavia in particular. And I also want to stress the Stalin's personal role in making the famine more complicated, or the let's say the food crisis more complicated, because of his personal involvement in the September-October decrees, which are mentioned by a lot of historians, including by Yoram Gorlizki and and Klepnik in your book on Cold War, or what's called Cold Peace. Okay. Yeah, and other volumes of documents. So this is kind of documented aspect, but not very kind of put in the forefront, let's say, of explaining the post-war famine. In terms of the scale of the famine, I accept Michael Ehlmann's estimations, 1.5 million at the level of the Soviet Union in general. But if you take it, so basically, in absolute numbers, Russia suffered the most, 500,000, then Ukraine, 300,000, Moldavia, 123,000. But if you take proportionally, Moldova suffered the most, 5%, about 5% of the population died. And this is the minimal estimate that we can prove according to the official documents, not kind of calculations used in the Soviet famine of the 30s, the most known Holodomor, the Ukrainian phase of the famine. And Kazakhstan, of course, Sana Cameron's book, it's essential in understanding the initial famine and the Soviet famine in general. In terms of theoretical framework, I also agree basically with Michael Ehlmann saying that the post-war famine was a preventable food availability decline famine. But we should take into account Whitcroft corrections recently, saying that actually the state grain reserves in 46 were less than that calculated before, about 3 or 4 million tons less. So that's why I said I take Ehlmann's argument with some reserves. Another important book, and actually not a lot of books in comparison with the 30s, the famine of the 30s. We have a book, only a book in Russian. Let me begin with Zima. This is a standard narrative of the famine, Soviet famine in general, with a chapter on Moldova and other republics, and very interesting chapters on criminality, chapters on the impact of the war, and so on and so on and so on. But still, the interpretation is kind of perestroika, kind of very simplistic, kind of Stalin he wanted to revenge against the peasant and so on and so on. But in terms of empirical data, it's still, I would say, the standard book on the post-famine, as Whitcroft and Robert Davis' book is the standard one on the famine of the 30s. And in English, we have a book by Nicholas Ganson, putting the famine in the Cold War perspective, international relations, Truman, so on and so on. In terms of the sources, it's not a problem of accessing sources, it's about selecting sources. I have about probably 200,000 files at all levels, from the Moscow archives, GASP, and then Republican archives, government archives, MVD, very good one, especially on the cannibalism. And I'll show you an example of Spetsovshchenie, how the cannibalism cases were documented. KGB archives, not so much as the MVD, and my sense is that MVD archives are more important than KGB archives if you want to research such topics as famine and social history and so on and so on. Even repressions, I would say, it's more important, at least for the late Stalinist period. Then there are files from the Minister of Finance, Minister of Agriculture, Zagodzerno, district archives, I told you, county archives, and we have also oral testimonies, about three volumes published, and a special one on Gagauzia, about 100 testimonies. So as I told you, my initial, let's say, idea why I started to research this topic is because of the data I gave you, the great difference between proportionally of the deaths in Soviet Moldavia in comparison with Russia and Ukraine. So 10 times more than in Russia, proportionally the death toll, and 5 times more than Ukraine. So this is the essential, let's say, figure that should be explained. So then comes why Moldova was hit most. Basically, one argument is that I'm not endorsing it totally, but it's interesting, I think, to take it into account. The Serbia is a border area, part of interior Romania, and yes, and then during the war, so a territory belonging to the ex-Nazi ally. And this came to my mind when I found documents about oral orders given by Colonel Ashachmanov, the chief of the 22nd border guard, Moldavian border guard, and saying, this is documented by the military procuratory report, saying that you did the right thing to people who executed the people, including teenagers. You should strike fear by spilling their blood. In Russian, it would be мы должны пугать их кровью. So this is a kind of approximative translation. Then another reason why Bessarabia was hit most, not only Moldavian SSR, but Bessarabia as a whole, so including the Ismail region, which is now part of Odessa region, is that Bessarabia and other so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov territories were not collectivized yet, but still, interesting enough, from the uncollectivized territories, only Bessarabia is a part. So here I should take in account also the resistance debate, in which sense the resistance of the local population, the armed resistance, was a factor in this. So reminding you that in Bessarabia, the resistance, armed resistance, was less prominent than in Western Ukraine and Lithuania, where Saulius. Congratulations, resistance was, and Ukrainians, yeah, was one of the. Okay, so I think the less resistance factor, let's say, is also to be counted here. In many ways, I don't have time now to get more in detail, but I think it's a factor to be taken into account. Then we have Moldavia as a result of the October-September 46 decrees, which let's say were taken at the level of the Soviet Union and Bessarabian part of Moldavian SSR, and the Bessarabian districts of Ukraine also have been hit most in terms of cutting the cards of the rural specialists, not of the peasants, because peasants never had been included in the food card system in the 30s or in the post-war period as well. And then we have the drought, and I'll show you the graphics with the drought, how severe it was. And then I think it's another factor is the way the local elites are communicating with Moscow. For instance, Khrushchev reported earlier on the famine approaching in Ukraine. The Moldavians reported very lately, only in November, December 46, when it was very late to change something dramatically in the positive direction. So basically, let me go to the all union developments. So basically, as I said earlier, so we have a drought in the main grain areas of the Soviet Union, except Western Siberia and Kazakhstan. I should add here, yes, and as well, I should remind you that the drought was a world level, world scale, let's say, phenomenon in the post-war period in 46 especially. In Soviet Moldavia, the drought was more severe than in other areas of the Soviet Union, and basically when I looked at the rainfall, actually it's not so dramatic in comparison with the previous years, but the problem was in the unequal distribution. You know, you need, for instance, rain in May. You don't have in May, you have in June a lot, but not in the right moment just for, so this is also important to note. It's kind of climate crisis stuff, so it's not drought as such, but the unequal distribution during the months, the key months for grain. Geography is very important in understanding the famine, the regional variations, and I'll show you some maps about that. The map is giving us very good answers to what happened. Then explaining the regional variations, the south and center suffered more. First of all, because of the drought, but also because the southern and center districts had traditionally less reserves. Yes, there were less, let's say, poor areas, and it's still today. So it's a factor of long duration perspective also. It's not only about the 46, 47. But nevertheless, the north as well is experiencing the famine just a few months after the center and south is experiencing the peak of the famine. Yes, the people from the north, were also, well, more kind of in a way, in a more positive kind of situation. They were closer to Bukovina and to other parts of Ukraine that experienced less famine, so they could go there and get stuff. Those from the south could go to the Izmail area and Odessa area, which was hit also very badly. So why to go there? No sense of that. So here's the. So here you have the old Union grain harvest, and you can see 46 a very bad year. In Moldavian SSSR, you have also these big discrepancies in especially in relation to the 47. Here you have monthly precipitations in the south, in Comrat, the capital of the Gagauz Republic, Autonomous Republic, which was hit most actually in the Gagauz population, if you ask me about ethnic component. So you can see here 46 bad weather in August, September when is the month of the starting of the sowing and so on and so on. And you have here the Soroka in the north, comparatively better, having a better harvest and less dystrophics and less cannibalism and less excess deaths. You can have here the long-term perspective of precipitations. And here as well, and here is important to see that 46 is more kind of, it's close to two crises in the interwar in the 30s, in the Romanian administration, but the death toll was less, about 10,000 according to the data I had access to in Romanian archives. So it's about climate, but it's about politics as well. We have food riots, and you can see here as well the first Cahul and then there are in the south. You have the signals of the famine in the south, yes, early in the spring already, yes, and less in the. So we have this variable as well, yes. I put here the very important table with population per county. It's from December 46. So we have the number of the population in need officially recognized. So about more than 3,100 people already in December. The peak of the famine is February, March. We have. You can see here about 400,000 persons were officially recognized as, let's say, in need of state assistance to deal with the famine. We have dystrophics per county here, also supporting my argument that there is a relation between climate, harvest, and dystrophics per county. Mortality, I have in general, we don't have. I should compile from different, which is a very difficult process. I should go to the. I started already to the district level in order to compile a regional, let's say, variation on districts in terms of mortality. Cannibalism I have here on geographical. You have here the map, also following my argument that the center and the south was hit most according to this indicator as well. And here you have the same data differently presented. And here is the example of the cannibalism from Spetsvachemny. This is from the Особая папка министра МВД, which is giving us an idea about the party archive. In the party archive, you can find only 40 cases of cannibalism in the Особая папка ministra over there. You can find about 150 cases, yes. Out of them, only one in Transnistria, which was collectivized, which was Sovietized already, yes. It's very interesting kind of. And here, probably this is the main map that shows you what I said. Ukraine, Romania, what happened? And it's about Bessarabia, not about only Moldavia, you see? And it's a map that we compiled together with Stephen Croft, Whitcroft, Jan Bishop, Philip Stavisky, in the framework of the Australian Research Council project on cost of famine. Conclusions, you can read yourself probably. Easier and than me here. So basically, resuming what I said, and also the fact that Ukraine and Belarus, for instance, they get international support, and you know very well that Ukraine and Belarus was, you know, UN members and all the stuff. So different kind of. So the same, so the mortality is higher and dystrophy and cannibalism is higher. All these hard indications of famine in the Bessarabian territory, which gives us or remind us of this revenge. Yes, it's Bessarabia as a part. A little bit Bukovina, you can mention also former Soviet Romanian territory in the interwar. The same goes about dystrophy and cannibalism. Ethnic component, I already said, if you ask me about the ethnic component, proportionally, the Gagauz suffers most. Why? We should explain that. What I can tell you very briefly now is that at that moment, the Gagauzes were not perceived and were in reality very Russified as they are today. They were more kind of perceived as loyal to the Romanians, according to different indicators. The number of communist members involved in anti-Romanian activities during the interwar, during the war, and another stuff. They were very fluent in Romanian, and so on and so on. But things changed from that moment. And also other data I already mentioned. The center, it was the drought, one of those factors, but also the fact that the main military operations in 44 took place in the center. The population was evacuated to Transnistria, to Odessa region, and for 3 months, they were told that they were evacuated for 2 months, just get some bread and we'll come back. So 3 months, you know, fields and all the stuff were destroyed, and also. So this is a factor as well. In the north, I said they were going to West Ukraine. In the south, that was not the case. North, the better quality Chernozem, Polsha. Then water reserves as well. Then economy was more diversified. If you had soya, you could give 1 kilogram of soya for 2 grain kilograms to the states, and so they also were in a better position in this sense. So that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Much for very data-rich and interesting presentation. So the next speaker is Alex Marshall. He is talking about Bolshevizing the Borderlands, Suslov in Lithuania, 1944-46. I guess for people wait here, Alex has an introduction, but for others, he is a city lecturer of history at the University of Glasgow, has published extensively on the Russian Empire and Soviet Union, including on subjects as diverse as Lenin, the Russian Revolution, and with books entitled The Caucasus Under the Soviet Rule, 2010, and The Russian General Staff in Asia, 1800-1917, in 2006. Alex is currently completing a biography of the Soviet ideologue Mikhail Suslov. So, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as has already been said, this is part of a larger project, and obviously I chose this episode in a way because it's a microcosm that you can convey in something close to 20 minutes. But Suslov obviously had a very long career, which is probably known to most of you. He's chiefly known as the main ideologue of the Soviet regime for much of its existence. He comes to the height of power in Stalin's lifetime after 1946 and remains, with a few days exception, in the Politburo / Presidium right until his death in 1982. So there have been sort of 4 attempts to write biographies of Suslov in the past, which easily the best one is the most recent Russian publication by Vyacheslav Gorlizki, obviously making use of archives in a way that past writers could not. But the first attempt was by Sergei Petrov in the early 1980s, Red Eminence, sorry. Actually a surprisingly good book, but obviously without any access to archives. A very short book co-authored by Roy Medvedev, which is not terribly good, I have to say. And then a thesis by an American who I believe is now in the US State Department, Paul Carter, which is chiefly about Suslov as a head of ideology. So my own book is obviously trying to complete numerous attempts to give us a better picture of who Suslov was, what his career was, and what he meant in terms of history of Soviet communism. Now, in writing the book, what the kind of issues I've been struggling with are the issues that we already talked about today in terms of how do you describe intergenerational conflict, where does Suslov fit in terms of our understanding of the arc of Soviet history. And for the purposes of the book, I'm describing Suslov as part of a critical second generation of communists who have been more or less missed in the literature. So a lot of the traditional Soviet literature has been about either the first generation, the 19th century, men, Stalin, Kaganovich, Molotov, or for obvious reasons, it's been about the Shestishnyaniki and the Perestroika generation. And the middle generation, what I'm calling here the middle generation, the men and women, but mostly men, I'm afraid, of 1902, Brezhnev's generation, tend to get dismissed as Stalinists or promulgators of stagnation, people without ideas. So I'm using Suslov as a way to sort of reinvestigate some of the stereotypes, both about Suslov and about that second generation in general. Now, Suslov is an interesting character in general because it's very hard to find anything nice ever written about him. No one seems to have ever liked Suslov. This is relevant to the theme today because a famous piece of samizdat, which came out in the 1970s, actually described this very episode of Suslov in Lithuania between 1944 and 1946. And in the samizdat literature, he's described as the second hangman of Lithuania, the man who expelled thousands of Lithuanians and basically the equivalent of Hess. So the samizdat author concludes his account that Suslov, although he tries to be a decent man, his hands are covered in blood, and that people who shake his hand today should remember that he is the second hangman, the first being Muraviev Vilensky, as you're all aware. So one of the things I thought I would try to do today, and what I've done in this particular chapter of the book, is using what we now know, the archives of what's published, is to obviously compare this traditional image of Suslov with what he actually did in Lithuania. And as I'll foreshadow my conclusion, at the end is that he's not quite as bad as this, but he's not a saint either. The actual picture is I would argue, more complicated. So the purposes of this paper are to look at the actual role of the Lithuanian Bureau, of which Suslov was a leading member. This is one of 4 bureaus created by Stalin in the middle of 1944, which were dispatched by Moscow to the 3 Baltic states and to Moldova in order to guide the local parties in order to do their job better. So Malenkov, I know you all know this story, but Malenkov had sent inspectors to these provinces as the Wehrmacht was driven back to see how the local communist parties were doing. The reports were somewhat negative, particularly on things like reconstruction and recruitment to the Soviet army. And it was felt necessary to send these bureaus to the provinces in order to re-Bolshevize them in a more effective manner. So I want to look at what the Lithuanian Bureau did. I want to look at Suslov's own actual policies and attitudes at the time, so far as we can determine them from his speeches and from his private correspondence with Stalin and Malenkov and others. But obviously, in terms of the biography as a whole, this is a sort of tipping point in Suslov's own career. So he comes to Lithuania from Stavropol, and from Lithuania itself, he then goes to Moscow and directly joins the Central Committee. So this is part of his ladder to power, having sort of proven some degree of effectiveness in Lithuania. He appears to have been more or less rewarded by being appointed to the Secretariat of the Central Committee, where he was to remain, as I say, with a few days interruption here and there, basically for the rest of his life. So this is Suslov's, if you like, graduation ceremony to the height of power. So what was the role of the Lithuanian Bureau itself? Well, I would argue that it had sort of 3 main purposes, all of which feature in Suslov's accounts and his correspondence. One was reconstruction. So the first thing that Suslov emphasized in his reports to Stalin and to Malenkov was that very obviously Lithuania was a mess. Infrastructure was flattened. Vilnius itself was devoid of passenger rail links to other towns. There was no system for distributing bread to the population. There was no access to clean water, and there was very poor road links, and basically a lot of money and a lot of assistance was going to be needed to get the Republic back on its feet. The second aspect of the Lithuanian Bureau's activities and what it was obviously dealing with was the rise of an insurgent movement inside Lithuania itself, which had a number of sources, one of the primary ones being, of course, the Lithuanian Liberation Army. And this is part of the Forest Brothers movement across the Baltics as a whole, which obviously fought against Soviet reoccupation into the 1950s. I will talk briefly about the aspects of counterinsurgency, and when I use the term here anti-bandit warfare, I'm not implying that I view these people as bandits, but merely saying that this is how they are described in the reports of the time. And the third task that Suslov definitely saw himself as being necessarily involved with was political education. So it wasn't just about material resources, it was about better propaganda, better agitation, improving the quality of communist education and propaganda techniques inside Lithuania itself. And in fact, one of his first reports in January 1945 notes, in fact, that they have many of the resources to promulgate agitation and propaganda, but the thing that is missing is a very basic thing. There's no electricity. So he underlines this in red pencil in the report itself. You know, if we can fix this, then we can get moving on the propaganda front. So Suslov's priorities to begin with were engagement with the local party apparatus. He appears to have had a somewhat frosty relationship at the beginning with Sniečkus, the leader of the Lithuanian party apparatus at the time. And he reports to Stalin and to Malenkov that when he had first arrived from Moscow, Sniečkus had sort of met him rather frostily, rather coldly, and said to him, well, does this mean that the leading role is going to be played by the Russians now? So there was this kind of tension that Sniečkus had been in charge, and Sniečkus and the Lithuanian communists were concerned that they were going to be displaced by Russians and that this was going to be the start of some kind of Russification policy. So Suslov's main priority at the very beginning was to emphasize that this was not in fact the case. And he made two messages in order to try and communicate this. The first thing he said was he made a parallel to the Russian Civil War, which tells you a lot about sort of Stalinist stabilization policy towards the Western borderlands in general. Alexander Statiev has written about this, but he makes the analogy to the Turkmenissia or the Cav Bureau in the Russian Civil War. And he says it's like that. We're here to advise. We're not here to lead you. We're not here to dictate things, but we're here to make you better communists. But the second thing that he emphasizes really at the very beginning is that he's in favor of Lithuaniization. He thinks that there should be more propaganda in Lithuanian, there should be more party workers speaking Lithuanian, and that court proceedings and open trial proceedings against insurgents should be in Lithuanian. So the problem as Suslov sees it is a shortage of Korenizacija. And in fact, what Suslov is saying in much of his missives that are published and exist in his papers is that the Lithuanians need to do it for themselves, that we need the Lithuanians to take charge more, to take responsibility more for the successful restabilization of the Republic. And this is featured in his very first address to the Fourth Plenum in January 1945. He says very explicitly that workers who fail to respect local national conditions, who fail to recognize the necessity to develop Lithuanian culture, national in form and of course socialist in content, were in need of removal, whoever they are. So he's sort of saying, you know, I'm not a Russifier. I'm not here to promote Russians. I'm here, in fact, to promote Korenizacija. Now, in private, Suslov is very, very critical about the Lithuanian comrades. As early as February 45, in reporting to Malenkov, for example, he's reporting various what he sees excesses by the Lithuanian Communist Party, that they're irresponsible, that they're lazy, that one party cell, for example, instead of engaging in reconstruction, engaged in systematic alcoholism, and that propaganda itself was lacking, that it lacked what he called a fighting aggressive spirit. And Suslov regarded it as his role to improve the propaganda. So he set up courses in Marxism-Leninism, he got everyone reading the short course of Stalin, and he set up a plan to recruit 3,000 new agitprop workers. Now, in cultural policy, Suslov is foreign to Lithuania. He'd never been to Lithuania before. He would only periodically go back later in his life. So, you know, he doesn't know Lithuania. So he needed local allies within the party to advise him as to the best line in terms of cultural policy to take. And he appears to have had two main allies. One, Justas Paleckis, who is the unrecognized president of Lithuania, who writes to Suslov and says it would be a good idea to hold a Congress of Lithuanian intelligentsia. And Suslov says, yes, let's do that. So Suslov then takes that to Moscow, money is provided, and that Congress, about which quite a lot has been written, is then held in July 1945. And it invites Lithuanian cultural workers, writers, artists, and so on to Vilnius, and is remembered best for not being successful. The intelligentsia, Lithuanian intelligentsia, are not keen on being co-opted by the Communist Party, and in fact, many of them try and keep their distance. But what is notable at the Congress itself is that Paleckis makes this relatively famous speech in which he emphasizes that Lithuanian nationalism and communism are compatible. In other words, a formula of national communism. That traditional Lithuanian aspirations for national liberation are compatible with the Soviet program for addressing social inequality. So it's very much a national communist message at the time with a sort of Lithuanian flavor to it. And this was Paleckis's advice to Suslov, and Suslov was all for this. The other person who appears to have been important is the Lithuanian Minister of Education, Zugsta, I know I'm mispronouncing that, who wrote to Suslov a number of times inquiring as to whether he should rejoin the CPSU, and Suslov said, you absolutely should reapply and I'll support you. So Suslov was looking for these local collaborators, people within the Lithuanian political community who would support his program rather than trying to impose a program necessarily himself. Now, at that Congress in July, the only slogan that really met universal applause, yes, was the slogan Vilnius for the Lithuanians. So that was something that many Lithuanians could get around. Vilnius had not been a Lithuanian city, of course, until 1939. And one of the things that Suslov and Sniečkus were doing was deporting Germans and Poles from Lithuania, and Poles in particular from Vilnius itself. So this is again part of the program. You can call it in a way a nation building project. I'm not trying to imply that Lithuania was not a nation before this, but this is re-establishing the nation, if you like, after the war. And one of the messages that they seem to be trying to communicate is that Lithuania will be for the Lithuanians. Now this feeds into anti-bandit warfare as well. One of the things that Suslov first says in November 44 is that they need to use terror to repress banditry, which is kind of thing that you would normally expect him to say. For example, he says in relation to one case that for the head of each worker, each Soviet patriot killed by a bourgeois nationalist will take 10 bandit heads. So this is sort of decimation policy. They kill one of ours, we'll kill 10 of them. But what I want to argue here is that that is not in the main what Suslov's policy in fact is about. It has other elements. And in fact, what Suslov tends to emphasize most, again, is indigenization of the struggle. That actually this struggle should be conducted more by the East Jabitany battalions, the destruction battalions, and that more emphasis should be put on the Lithuanian recruitment into those battalions themselves, for which he proposes pushing land reform, taking land, putting it into the hands of the poor peasantry, and encouraging those poor peasantry in turn to enter these paramilitary formations. And this has effect. So the destruction battalions do grow in size in Suslov's own time in Lithuania. There are just over 2,000 of them in January 45. When he leaves just after January 46, there are over 8,000. So there's a big recruitment drive to get these paramilitary formations into the field. They take very heavy casualties, 3-to-1 ratio of dead to wounded, but they also make reports claiming that they are being effective in terms of anti-bandit warfare. Now, I'm running out of time, but one of the things that happens when Suslov is in Lithuania is he's almost done in by his own NKVD aide-de-camp. So he's come to Lithuania with Tikachenko from Stavropol. And Tikachenko in July 1945 actually writes to Beria and says, everything here is absolutely terrible. The Lithuanian party is full of traitors and lazy people, and Suslov himself is absolutely useless. He's making very boring, empty, meaningless speeches. So this seems to be an attempt to possibly purge members of the Lithuanian party at the time. In that report, Sniečkus is certainly in the firing line. So too is Letskis, and Suslov himself is in that firing line. So there appears to be an effort to gather compromat on both Sniečkus and Suslov. There was compromat gathered on Suslov's wife, which didn't get sent up the chain of command until actually Suslov had left Lithuania. But there's this sort of interesting tension within the Lithuanian Bureau itself. And the result of that tension is that Moscow sends instructions that you need to double down on the security measures. Anti-bandit operations need to be stepped up, and you need to be meeting, the three of you together more often in order to be coordinating yourselves. So after that report is made, there is an instruction, 14th of August 1945, that Suslov, Sniečkov and Tikachenko are going to meet together 3 days a week, and they're going to coordinate more with the local NKVD. Thank you, 1 minute. So there is emphasis more on coercion, but Suslov wants to keep this political cultural line. He doesn't think that you can win the anti-bandit war just by coercion, just by shooting people. He says on a number of occasions that it's got to be done by politics and by economic measures as well. Now, in the final minute, what I will say is that there are, as I say, in terms of the arc of Suslov's career, he came to Moscow. He was then appointed in charge of the Central Committee's Department of Foreign Policy, so he was promoted effectively. So what he did in Lithuania was obviously seen at some level to have been a success. And within the Foreign Policy Department, he then basically was put in overall charge of East German policy. So there was talk at one time at the end of 46 of him replacing Sergei Tupanov in East Berlin, and he brushed up his German. He'd learned it before the war so that he could read Marx and Engels, but he has these notebooks where he clearly brushes up his German, and he has meetings with Ulbricht and Grotewall and Pike at 47, 48, where he's basically mentoring the East Germans as well. Now, in summation, therefore, what I'm arguing here is that Suslov is neither a demon nor a saint. He's neither entirely meets the sort of samizdat version of him as a second hangman, but he's very far from an angel. The peak of deportations in Lithuania occurs after Suslov leaves. The biggest operation occurs in May 1948. So Suslov is not the one sort of personally signing off on the biggest deportation operations. And Suslov's policies at the time, as he expressed them publicly, emphasized building up indigenous support and Korenizacija. This is not to suggest that Suslov was, however, effective, merely that he's not necessarily the second hangman that he's sometimes portrayed as. There's also a lot of evidence that these policies did not turn things around, and one part of the evidence for that is obviously that they're still fighting the Forest Brothers in the 1950s. So this is my last slide. We talked yesterday about empire and whether the Soviet Union is an empire, and I thought I've discovered this in archives. I thought this is an interesting juxtaposition. One of Suslov's last speeches when he's in Vilnius standing for election to the Supreme Soviet, he says that the elections themselves prove that you're not a colony. The British don't ask the Indians to take part in elections. We do. You see, could you imagine 400 million people in India taking part in elections to the English Parliament? Of course not. So Suslov sees this as a cooperative, affirmative action empire, if it is any kind of empire. Other people obviously don't feel that way. And one of the things that happens at the same time is the NKVD reports an increase in attacks by the Forest Brothers at the time of the election campaign, including individual settlers, including Russian settlers, being targeted and assassinated and killed. 372 activist supporters killed, and this individual instance, February 8th, a peasant settler and his wife found hanging from a tree with a warning sign pinned to their bodies reading, "For those who go to vote." So that's how others saw it, and I'll leave it there. I'm out of time.
Much another quick paper. Pietro. Okay, so our third paper is by Pietro Shakarian with a book about Yerevan in 1954, Anastas Mikoyan, and Nationality policy reform in the Soviet Union in 54 to 64. So Pietro Shakarian is a lecturer in history at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan, and a historian of Armenia, Russia, and the Caucasus, with a focus on the Soviet Armenian during Khrushchev's tour. He earned his PhD in history at the Ohio State University. He's a main Russian European and Eurasian studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He's M.Lic. at Kent State University and his BA in history at John Carroll University in Cleveland. He's currently in the process of expanding his dissertation on Anastas Mikoyan and post-Stalin nationality policy into a book.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, Badior, and thank you especially to Michael for organizing this, and actually thank you to many of you here. Actually, Ron, who is my advisor at Michigan, I have to give a shout out to him, but also many of the authors here. So Natalia, also Alex, also Kolia. I've read all your articles, absorbed all your articles kind of when I was writing my dissertation. It's just a great honor to be here with everybody working on this issue. So basically, the big thing I would like to talk about today is the issue of nationality policy. Nationality policy, as we've known it in the field of Soviet studies, it's mostly we've been focusing on these issues of nationality policy in the Lenin and Stalin periods. And so now the field is beginning to move beyond that to the Khrushchev era. And we have, of course, Jeremy Smith's article recently here, which was there a Soviet nationality policy? And actually, I found evidence to suggest that a nationality policy was being developed during this period of the thaw, and that Mikoyan was a very influential figure in the formation of this nationality policy process. So kind of to give you some background, I'm going to talk about three aspects of Mikoyan and nationality in the thaw period. The first is his address on March 11th, 1954 in Yerevan. So he comes to Yerevan as a Supreme Soviet deputy, and he delivers a speech calling for a more kind of liberal line toward national expression and national cultures. Not only this, he also calls for the rehabilitation of the famous Armenian poet Yegesh Charens, who was kind of a symbol of NEP in the Armenian context, a symbol of kind of like the avant-garde, futuristic, exciting period of NEP. So you had that, speech in Yerevan, and basically I'm going to reflect on that, plus also Mikoyan's contribution to the third CPSU party program of 1961. This is where Alex's work comes in. Actually, this was kind of a foundation for me. I would have actually not have thought to look at this had it not been for Alex's paper, because I was thinking about where are places where they would have been talking about nationality issues in an official capacity to talk about what kind of a policy are they going to build, right? So I decided to look at this issue of the 1961 party program, and then finally, I came across Mikoyan's role in the Khrushchev's constitutional reforms. So this was the constitution, the reform constitution that was never realized, that Khrushchev was kind of working on, and he assigned Mikoyan to be the head of the subcommittee of nationality policy and national state construction. And what's amazing about it is actually all these threads are all connected with each other in some way, and I'm going to discuss that. So you have that. So first of all, I want to start off death of Stalin, March 5th, 1953. Now that's important because we're taking into account the fact that this Mikoyan speech on March 11th, 1954 is only 1 year after. This is only 1 year after and 2 years before Khrushchev's secret speech. This was, or so-called secret speech, at the 20th Party Congress. This is what's actually so remarkable about Mikoyan's speech. Actually, it can be framed in the context of these kind of the rising trend toward de-Stalinization, I guess you could say, but it really is quite a remarkable speech. So we know Khrushchev's secret speech. We know, of course, his condemnation of the cult of personality, Stalin's crimes, and so on and so forth. But really, I want to take you down here to this part of the Soviet Union, all the way down here to Yerevan, to Armenia, right? This is how the map looked of the Caucasus in 1954, right? Now, kind of interesting, you see some kind of borders that are not there today. This is a result of the deportations of North Caucasian nationalities. But going down here to Yerevan, taking you on a journey here. And yeah, and so this is the Armenian capital. And Mikoyan gives this speech on March 11th, 1954 in the shadow of Stalin himself. And this is actually quite remarkable because he's calling for the rehabilitation of one of Stalin's victims, Charens. And this was a major, major moment in the speech. But he also calls for a condemnation of both national chauvinism and national nihilism, or national nihilism being defined as the indifference to national cultures. So he's kind of going back to an earlier iteration of nationality policy, but still, this is kind of him officially articulating this. So you have, of course, I want to emphasize the context of this. Beria, as we know, was working, actually, as Mike has demonstrated, working with Khrushchev actually competitively on nationality problems, using this issue opportunistically as part of the power struggle. But there was no real kind of articulation of a policy. This is just them, using this issue of desire for greater national expression for political ends. This is not an articulated policy or concrete idea necessarily. So you have that. Beria is arrested and executed June and December 1953, and you have, of course, the rise of Nikita Sergeyevich, and also the downfall of other leaders. Arutynov in Armenia falls, and you have the rise of Soren Tovmasyan. You have the 17th Party Congress of the Armenian Communist Party in February 1954, which this actually sets the stage for Mikoyan's speech. So you have that. This already is interesting because in Tovmasyan's speech, he's referring to this idea of the cult of personality. He's actually kind of addressing it here, the harmful impact of the cult of personality. So that's reference. This isn't the first time it's mentioned, of course, but it's interesting that you have an Armenian party leader discussing this idea. But also you have the speech of great Armenian, or the Armenian writer Horacio Kochar, who basically kind of almost like he's setting the stage for Mikoyan. So a lot of the kind of figures Mikoyan mentions, Rafi, Charents, Kochar kind of tests the waters for Mikoyan at this party congress. And it's actually ironic because Kochar in 1937 was one of the people who condemned Charents and who said that Charents is a stone on the path of Armenian literature that should be removed, right? And we know what happened with Charents. Unfortunately, in 1937, he was executed, or not executed, excuse me, he died in custody, in NKVD custody. So you have that. Mikoyan invokes the names of two Armenian authors whose works had been repressed in Soviet times, or had been repressed in the Stalinist period, I should say specifically. Rafi, the great Armenian revolutionary writer, and Pakania. So he refers to them. He refers, of course, to Charents, the great poet. And actually, I can just play, if I can, over here, a clip of the audio. Do we have audio here? Yes, we do. Let's go. Yeah, there we go. So he has a very kind of очень сильный accent, армянский accent. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So massive applause for approximately, it's about like a 40-second applause when he mentions the name Charents. This is a big historical moment by which things really begin to change. So you have the mentioning of Charents. Actually, his wording in his original speech, this is from Gorlizki, the state archive, basically, and his original speech was that what the former Soviet authorities did to Charents was inadmissible, not just incorrect, like he said in the final version, but inadmissible. So he had actually originally stronger wording about Charents. This is actually quite, significant. And also this speech inspired, so there was a famous Armenian painter, actually not necessarily famous, kind of underrated Armenian painter, Regina Gazarian, who was a friend of Charents. She buried his manuscripts. When she heard this speech on March 11, 1954, she was inspired to run out in kind of a delirium. As soon as Mikoyan said the name Charents, she went out and exhumed the manuscripts from the ground for republication. Some of them had been damaged because they had been put in a barrel and had been buried, but she got them out, and she even made this painting, which is at the Charents Memorial Museum. It shows kind of a picture of 1937 repression and 1954, not 1956, 1954 as the release, where everything is kind of coming out. So this is actually quite interesting that she dates this kind of, Zinhali Jamanak or Thaw from 1954, not 1956. That's kind of an interesting aspect of how Armenians perceive this. Mikoyan also mentions the famous Armenian Bolshevik revolutionary leader, Alexander Myasnikan, who actually was sent to Armenia by Lenin to kind of stabilize the situation and really to kind of more or less implement the new economic policy in Armenia and to rebuild Armenia after this period of the First Republic. This is the Armenian Republic that existed during the Civil War era and also after the genocide of 1915. So you have Myasnikan, who's still honored today in Armenia as a great kind of leader who helped rebuild the situation, but he had actually not been mentioned for many decades, curiously enough. And so Mikoyan was also calling for him to be kind of, resurrected, so to speak. But the idea was, again, we are condemning indifference to national cultures, and we need to be more sensitive to these national figures, these people who were, catering to Armenian national culture and interests. So you have that. Also, he invokes Stepan Shalmian. He invokes, of course, the memory of the Baku Commissars. Ron has written about this extensively. As we know, he wrote the book on the Baku Commune. So that is kind of the speech, more or less. After the speech, the Armenian government already is requesting about 10,000 copies of the Armenian translation to be published in book form. It was published as a booklet, the Russian version, about 100,000 copies throughout the Soviet Union. So people knew about this speech. This was quite some speech. And a week after the speech, a early kind of rehabilitation commission, Rosmotrenia commission, kind of a reconsideration commission, is formed in the name of Mikoyan that includes Armenia's top leaders, Suren Tovmasyan, Anton Kochinyan, Yakov Zorobian, who basically kind of look at these cases of people who had been repressed during the Stalinist period, but also they look at cases of people who want maybe better housing or pensioners and this kind of a thing. But the major thing here is the focus on the repressions. This was actually in the Armenian archives. There's a copy of this in Garth, in Mikoyan's files as well. This is kind of a breakdown of the overall picture of what they're working on. Now, the speech, Mikoyan had already been receiving letters from people who he knew or people who he had been connected with, whose family members had been repressed in the Gulag. After Beria was arrested in June 1953, these letters began coming to Mikoyan's door. And after he gives the speech, in March 1954, by April 1954, the number of letters he receives mushrooms. It completely explodes. So this is kind of almost like a signal. When he mentions Charents, it's a signal to others that the state is open to kind of rehabilitations, right? So you have that. You have him looking over all these individual cases of rehabilitation, signing off on each one. He was personally invested in this process. That's actually the remarkable thing. Documents after documents after documents show how invested he was in this process of rehabilitation of former enemies of the people. So you have that aspect. You also have the fact that he actually, during the repressions, he tried to save this Armenian old Bolshevik, Danush Averdian, and many years later now, Danush's son is writing to him. Within a very short period of time, he's already working on his rehabilitation. Also, Agassi Khanjian, who was an Armenian old Bolshevik, or Armenian, Bolshevik national communist leader, I guess you could say, who had been killed in 1936 as a result of a power struggle with Beria. Basically, his mother wrote a letter to Mikoyan in 1954 after she heard the speech, requesting that Khanjian be rehabilitated. So Mikoyan opened this case, he brought it to the procurator, and so now this Khanjian case was also being reconsidered, and this led to more cases being reviewed as well. The speech was used in the process of rehabilitating Charents. It was quoted extensively here. And also it was actually, this is interesting too, this is from the rehabilitation file of Bakuns, another Armenian writer who was resurrected, if you will, after the Stalinist repressions. And basically it's saying that really Charents was, you don't even need really the official rehabilitation, because as soon as Mikoyan mentioned Charents' name, he was rehabilitated automatically. So you have that. So, and now you have recitations of Charents in Yerevan by this guy, Suren Kocharian. So you have that, people writing about the republication of Charents. This is by a kind of a Ukrainian futurist writer, Postupalsky. So you have that. Rafi is republished, and so on and so forth. And Mikoyan's speech here is quoted in Kommunist. This is the Armenian newspaper, Armenian Russian language newspaper, calling for that. And eventually you have, Stalin's statue. Oh, Stalin statue is eventually replaced with this. So anyway, but Mikoyan, Khrushchev, I just want to kind of, I'm going to have to probably rush through this a little bit. This kind of sets the stage for former Gulag returnees to kind of begin the process of kind of rehabilitations and actually to advise kind of Khrushchev on the de-Stalinization process. Lev Shamyan, Stepan Shamyan's son, was involved with this. Mikoyan is meeting with rehabilitated Baku Bolsheviks. Now, I spent a lot of time on that, but the third CPSU party program, Mikoyan begins to take many of these ideas that he expresses in the speech and put them into the program. So the original version of the CPSU party program's platform on nationalities was very utopian, and it actually had this idea of kind of slianie, this idea of a merger of nations to realize that. Because Khrushchev felt we had already gotten to the stage of developed communism, so now we should realize this idea of a merger of nations. But Mikoyan basically pushed back against this and instead advocated for this idea of slibyzhenie, the idea of rapprochement of nations instead, that we should kind of coexist and we should not force any, kind of mergers. He's writing here about that basically that this is not the task of the party, that this is a natural process. We should not force nations to be assimilated, that this is not a party task. That's what he's saying in these notes that I found in Garf on his comments on the party program. He's crossing this out, this idea of kind of in preparation for, this idea of sliania, in preparation to prepare these nations for their merger. He's rejecting this out of hand, outright. So you have that. He also rejects the notion of defining nationality policy as something that is just the ethno-federal state. He rejects the term defining nationality policy as territorial, which is really, really interesting, that he's beginning to kind of think about this as something like, let's say, the rights of Armenians in Moscow. Not necessarily the rights of the Armenian Republic, but the rights of individuals of different nationalities in the Soviet Union. So he's talking about that. You have here again this idea of territorial, that, and also the idea of basically emphasizing again, kind of pushing back against kind of assimilation, that we should not kind of necessarily force these nations to be into like one internationalist culture, but we should respect every nation's right to be sovereign, independent, separate, to have their own kind of cultural space. So you have that, but this actually set the stage for Mikoyan's work on as to be the head, the chairman of the subcommittee of nationality policy and national state construction during Khrushchev's constitutional reforms. So when the third party program is unveiled at the 22nd Party Congress, yes, this is kind of when Khrushchev, shortly after, begins to pursue this idea of a new constitution. He appoints Mikoyan to lead that subcommittee. You have first secretaries of Armenia, first secretary of Georgia, first secretary of Uzbekistan. You have different first secretaries on this committee to determine many issues regarding nationality. Actually, Yakov Zorobian, again, the first secretary of Armenia, seen here, was very close with Mikoyan, and he was involved with this. You had debates. He met with Soviet legal experts, juristi, to discuss these issues of what should be changed. And in the end, the idea was, first of all, they discussed the basis of the reform, the idea that it should be based on kind of Leninist kind of principles, and also the third party program, the structure of the state, the idea of actually kind of devolving really kind of, well, what are we? Are we a federation? Are we a union? What is the nature of the Soviet state? Are we a confederation? That's what they were discussing and actively, debating in this meeting. And then you also had Republican rights. You had this issue that basically Mikoyan was favoring an extremely devolved union state where where the republics had significantly more rights. But then you had this issue of the status of national autonomies, that how do you reconcile this necessarily with enhancing the rights, let's say, of national autonomous units like Abkhazia. So you have that. And it's a really, really remarkable reform. They also take into consideration criticisms from so-called bourgeois states and federations, federal republics. They look especially to the Yugoslav example, because this is something that is not necessarily a bourgeois Western state, but it is in the socialist camp. It's a federation. They look closely at the Yugoslav constitution, especially on nationality matters. And you have also input from others as well, but I'm not going to go over that. And we have this. I want to mention that this desire for devolution continues. It's expressed in Armenian films like this Mi in Nashi Gori, or We in Our Mountains. And this film also features a famous Armenian actor, Frunzik Mokirchian, and here he is debating with Kikabidze about who is the fourth republic, I guess you could say. But yeah, so that is my kind of presentation. There's a lot more to discuss. All right, there are a lot of details, a lot of nitty gritty that I can go on this topic, but I will save that for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for so a last paper and of the panel, also last paper of the conference, I think, because there'll be something else later. But the final paper is the last one by Yoram Gorlizki, after the 20th Party Congress, Liberalization and the Problem of Social Order. Yoram Gorlizki is professor and head of politics at the University of Manchester. His most recent book, Sub-State Dictatorship, Networks, Loyalty, and Institutional Change in the Soviet Union, was co-authored with Oleg Plivnyuk, was recently named a Foreign Affairs Press Book of 2021. Congratulations. He has published in a range of interdisciplinary journals, including Economic History Review, the Journal of Historical Geography, Journal of Modern History, Slavic Review, and the American Journal of Comparative Law, and is currently completing a book on the Soviet justice system from the Stalin to the Khrushchev eras. He was elected a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2020. Congratulations again. So over to you, 20 minutes.
Okay, so let me begin by thanking Mike. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me. Thank you for thinking about 1,000,001 things over the last couple of days. But thank you also for your commitment and belief in Soviet political history. And without that, this conference wouldn't have happened. Okay, so when Mike suggested I give a paper, I thought that I would present some original research, which comes out of a book, which I've almost finished, and which I've been working on for a very long time, on the Soviet justice system. And in fact, this is a chapter 4 from that book. But it then occurred to me that given that this is the first opportunity I've had to give a face-to-face kind of in-person presentation on my work since the pandemic, that I would begin by saying something about the book that, that Alex mentioned. And you've already attended or listened to 21 papers, so I'm going to try and take pity on you to a degree, and I'm not going to subject you to an enormous amount of information, but I want you to imagine a dictatorship. I want you to think about a dictatorship and what it might look like. So the first type of dictatorship, you have a very powerful dictator who instills fear and elicits awe in those around him. I'm using the male pronoun advisedly here, but it could be a she. Makes free use of repression. His ruling group has no obvious means of getting rid of him. So it's a particular type of dictatorship. So now imagine a second kind of dictatorship, in which the leader is still a dictator, but it's more a first among equals. There are limits on his use of repression, and those at the summit of the system do have the institutional means of getting rid of the leader. So these are both dictatorships according to any definition that you might want to use of dictatorship, but they're two very different kinds. And the political scientist Milan Stolik refers to this as an established autocracy, and that is a contested autocracy. By and large, it's probably better to try and get contested autocracies rather than established ones. And that's certainly been the case with Soviet and more recently Russian history. The question is, how do we get from there to there? How do we get from A to B? And most scholars who've worked on this question have argued that it can only really happen if the dictator dies or is incapacitated, or there's some major social or geopolitical upheaval, such as a war or revolution. And that flows actually from this point, where the ruling group has no obvious means of getting rid of him. That was true of Stalin, it's probably true of Putin as well. Now, what we argue in the book is that in the Soviet case, it's actually surprisingly unrelated to the removal of the dictator. And in fact, if you want to understand the transition from that to that, what you really need to do is to look very closely, very carefully at what's going on within the state. And if you do that, then you will also discover some very, very interesting things about what's going on in Soviet society at the time. And more than that, there is a, in a sense, kind of long-term resonance or kind of implication of this argument. And that is that you're only going to get a transition from A to B if it happens internally, which is to say, it's not going to be a result of sanctions, it's not going to be a result of an invasion or of another war, but it's going to have to come internally. Okay, the book covers a 30-year period, 3 administrations, and it begins to a degree with this guy here. We don't argue that Stalin was weak. In fact, we argue that Stalin was about as powerful as any modern dictator has been over the last 120 years. But the question is how powerful is the most powerful dictator? And how can we assess that? How can we make sense of that question? The starting point for the new book is a book that Oleg and I wrote in 2004 called Cold Peace. And in that book, we identified a division of labor between a Politburo that was dominated by Stalin and a council of ministers in which he had no role. And what we argue is that Stalin deliberately delegated power to this new institution because he realized that that was much more likely to lead to effective and relatively rational system of government, because he realized the limitations to his own powers, if you like, and his own kind of attention and his ability to control things. And what we do in the new book is we argue there's a similar process at work with regional leaders. So there's a similar division of labor between an area that Stalin can control and another area to which he sort of delegates power. So Stalin delegates power. This is something that is a theme that runs throughout the book. The question is why? There are 2 arguments. One is a historical argument. The Soviet Union is a deeply traditional society. Some regional leaders in the mid-1930s were Stalin's own peers, and they were old Bolsheviks. And they were individuals that Stalin regarded as a direct threat to him. And that was one of the reasons why he felt he simply had to get rid of them. That isn't true of the regional leaders of the 1940s. They were all, by any conceivable measure, his juniors. And Oleg always refers to them as Malchishki. I mean, really Malchishki, you know, by comparison with Stalin, there wasn't even any hint of a coup or of an attempt to remove him, or of a threat, of a credible threat to his power. But there's also a theoretical explanation. And in any large organization, there is a trade-off between a center that controls resources and local agents who control information. So Alex mentioned that I'm at the moment the head of the Department of Politics, which has 80 people, which is lodged within a very, very large university. And what we can see is that it's the center that controls resources. It's the center that controls appointments. It's the center that controls investments of any kind and promotions. But it's I who control the resource, the information that I control the information that goes up. And there's a constant tug of war between them and me. I'm a local agent. I'm in control of all the local information. And this is just an example, but it's true of any large organization, and it was most certainly true of the Soviet Union. Now, what Stalin realizes is that he can micromanage regional leaders, obcom leaders, but what he can't do is to control what happens on the ground. He's just one individual. And so what he does is to create local dictators, sub-state dictators. And this is one example, Bagirov from Azerbaijan. What we also argue, and this is slightly more contentious, is that Stalin is a bad man. He's about as bad as you can get. But there is a certain rationality in how he operates. And what he's able to do, he has a better intuitive understanding of how organizations, particularly large organizations, work than certainly than Khrushchev, but also than Brezhnev. And what he does is to come up with a more internally consistent institutional solution to this problem, the problem of controlling local agents, where you don't have the information about what they're actually doing than any other leader, any other Soviet leader. Okay, along the way, what we do is provide accounts of compromat and governance through compromat. So one of the problems with compromat is extremely difficult to get really reliable evidence rather than hearsay. There are very, very few credible academic articles on compromat. One of the only examples actually is from Ukraine, where a scholar in America managed to get hold of telephone conversations from I think it was the early 2000s, and he constructed an argument around it. We do get information that we think is fairly reliable. And what we argue is that in many cases in the Soviet Union, what you have is a low trust environment. It's a little bit like a kind of mafia environment where you're not really liable to trust people. And the only way in which you will cooperate with them is if you have you have the goods on them somehow. And what happens is that it doesn't take place on an individual level, but you get a system of regular governance through compromat. And we come up with examples of where that happens, where the whole political system is organized around this. And there are some people who argue there's a version of precisely that in Russia at the moment, that there are all these leaders who are pinned down by Putin because he has compromat and they can't move, they can't resign, they can't do anything, because that's how he's come to power. We don't really have the evidence for that, but we do have evidence of historical compromat. We have an account of nationalism, and perhaps I should say the emergence of national consciousness. So what we're arguing, in a sense, that the center isn't really interested in simply controlling individuals and establishing alliances and coalitions. What the regime really needs, more than anything, are local leaders who command the respect of local populations and local elites. And this is entirely consistent with the logic of indigenization. And in a sense, what we're doing is providing a kind of an overarching explanation of things like indigenization from earlier periods, but it's also consistent with Natalia's, I think, really excellent paper yesterday, where you have an ideological system in the 1960s and 1970s that talks about, the rush to communism and Sliani and Fujimi and things that no one really believes in. And what you have is a local leader who says we have to adapt this to local conditions, so local Republican conditions, and to convert it into statements that people will really believe. And that's an adaptation at the ideological level of this general argument. And at the level, not of Congress policy, but in terms of ideas and ideology of not only republics appropriating, if you like, ideology, but the center being kind of acquiescing in this and realizing that it actually needs this for the system as a whole to function. Elections, we have a lot on elections. Most earlier work on elections has been on state elections. We provide, I think it's very interesting material on party elections. And there were revolts, there were mutinies in 1947, 1948. No one really ever knew about these mutinies. And we argue that the elections were used by Stalin, by the center, in order to overcome its principal agent problem in an ideologically acceptable way. So what the center is doing is it's using elections in order to generate information about how local leaders actually how they operate. Okay, I'm going to kind of try and move swiftly through this. So consolidation of status hierarchies. There's a lot on systems of seniority and how they become increasingly consolidated in the late 1940s, 1950s, and they culminate in 1962. Okay, there's also a lot on fraud and statistical deception. So Khrushchev is a firm believer in the party as an agent of reform and progress. And what he realizes in 1961 is that it's actually the party that is the main driver of falsification. And that leads to what we believe is the real turning point in the post-war era. So I'm actually going to move to this. I'm just going to use that here. If you look at the turnover of regional party leaders, the real turning point, the real inflection point is not the post-war, not the end of the war, not Stalin's death, but this huge purge that takes place in 1961. And that's the moment when Khrushchev realizes that all these people that he'd been relying on to provide him with accurate information have actually been lying to him. And that's actually much more important than the succession to Khrushchev in 1964.
Which god Hierarchies,
Sure.
Which god Hierarchies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah. So we argue that it's to do with the Rizan affair. It's something that I've written about elsewhere, and it led to. This was the most important crisis when Khrushchev was removed. The other members of the Politburo keep on going on about the Rizan affair. It's more important than U2 or the various other crises in this period, including the nationality crisis, interestingly. From a comparative perspective, we argue that unlike cooptation, which is what Dinah, for example, was talking about in your paper, and it is important in the Soviet Union, the most important kind of mechanism for control is expulsion. And this allows us to compare one-party dictatorships with other forms of dictatorships, such as monarchies and military dictatorships. This is very, very peculiar to one-party states, and that comes alongside control of ideology. And expulsion and ideology are very, very closely tied to each other. Okay, I only have another probably 2 minutes or so, so I'm just going to really rush through what I was going to talk about. And actually, it starts off with the secret speech. I don't think there's really very much point in me sort of saying much about this. All I'll do is just to summarize it and to argue that toward the end of 1956, when you have the rebellions in Eastern Europe and the upturn, upsurge in like attacks on the leadership and kind of known as anti-Soviet activity, is something that Robert's worked on, of course, in his book. You get a real test for the first time of the new system and whether it really works and whether the new justice system works. And what I do, in fact, this book that I've been working on myself, is, okay, this is just to show how different I am from earlier contributors, the liberalization theorists and the utopian come totalitarian theorists, such as Pierre Hordin or Harold Berman. I'm not going to go into why. One thing perhaps I will just kind of highlight here. One of the things, I think actually this kind of relates in a way to Mike and what you were writing about earlier on, and your methodology. What we have is an instance where Khrushchev is actively campaigning for something, the anti-parasite tribunals, with which he's very closely associated, and he's blocked. He's blocked by the lawyers. And what is really interesting is that they ground their opposition in the Constitution. The Constitution really matters. And in fact, this is the theme that runs throughout the book. Sorry. Yeah. So this is something it's something that runs throughout the book. The other part of this, which is, I think, in some ways for me more interesting, is that prosecutions for anti-Soviet activity are held back by the courts. And the reasons they're held back go back to a campaign that was launched under Stalin in 1948 against unfounded prosecutions. And as much as the KGB and political leadership might want to undo this, they can't. It's really woven into the fabric of the justice bureaucracies. So there was something about social order. I won't really go into that. But there is, on the one hand, liberalization, socialist equality. There's a real problem with social order, murder, hooliganism. Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'll just very quickly read through this quotation. We should understand that criminals are our political enemies. We're progressing to communism, but they are getting in our way and hindering our advance. They draw honest young workers into their orbit. It's appropriate to recall that during the counter-revolution rising in Hungary, not the least important part was played by criminal elements. If a criminal murders, robs, or cripples a Soviet worker, or morally corrupts a young lad, in what way is he not a saboteur? It's not an attack on the life of the citizen, a diversion. The criminal despises our society, is hostile to it. He is our most real enemy. That means we must treat him as a saboteur, as a political enemy. This is 1959. And what you have is an attempt, to a degree, to resuscitate some of the language and the worldview of the Stalin era, but it runs aground, and for reasons, again, which I'm not going to go into. The last thing I would say is just about the militia, which I think is very, very interesting in this period, and this, in a sense, provides us with an ability to kind of mount, to create like a picture, like the social history of the Soviet state. It's a mass organization with over 250,000 officials, 46% of whom have no more than primary education. Okay, so I won't, I mean, all I'll say is the militia are violating socialist legality. They're arresting people, they're beating people, they're murdering people. And this is a continuation of basically their practices in the 1940s. You have Khrushchev sitting in the Kremlin saying, oh, we're going to have destalinisation. In terms of the state, it hasn't really changed. So, conclusion, 1956, the idea of socialist equality had become sufficiently institutionalized to withstand significant political pressures, including Khrushchev's proposal on parasites and the potentially destabilizing crackdown of late 1956 on anti-Soviet elements. And there is a point of convergence with this new book and sort of say dictatorship. The key inflection point, I'm absolutely clear about that, is 1961, not 1956, or Stalin's death or Khrushchev's removal. State practices, both among the elite justice agencies and the militia, are shaped by what happened in the late 1940s. And it's a legacy that they can't shake off. I think that's it.
Wonderful, thanks very much. We'll just have to go to read the book now, if you haven't already. We have about 35 minutes for questions. Yes, and I don't know if the presenters would like to come and sit in front, perhaps. And Igor, you want to come and so again, just a lot of questions, and try to be brief because we are just plan. So to meet it first, David.
A similar question for both Alex and Pietro in regards to Suslov's activities during the war period. How much of that is a reflection of the decisions and the temperament of Suslov, and how much of that is simply that's what general nationality policy was in 43-44, this period of concession to local national interests in that period of the war, concessions to local language, to great military units, to local figures and stuff like that, and religion as well. This is looking with regard to Mikoyan. Obviously, Mikoyan is a key figure in 1954 and after Stalin. You talked about how Beria and Khrushchev's cooperation in nationality policy, addressing nationality policy, is not articulated, but how to articulate it as articulated needs to be in the context, or is it ever in the context of nationality policy? It seems to me that what is happening by 1954 is really kind of a continuation of what Beria and Khrushchev and the other members of the collective leadership have been pushing even from 1952, before Stalinist death. There were also attempts to rehabilitate other figures, right? Besides Students, but more generally, more usually party figures like Chuba, Cașu, in that early period. Ilya Ehrenberg's short story from which the fall gets its title, right? Was published at about the same time, in July of 1950. So how much of what Mikoyan was doing was sort of separate from the larger situation in considerations towards policy in general and nationalities policy more specifically. And also when you say that this was sort of returning to Cașu or 1920s conception, how much really was Armenia at that point, even by the death of Stalin, different from that? I mean, you still had in the South Caucasus Cașu as a principle of recruitment, in the local languages. It is interesting that the speech by Mikoyan was apparently in Russian. That's the recording of it is in Russian. But how much different is that from what that is?
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Pietro and a question for Alex. Pietro, I was intrigued when you mentioned in 1961 Mikoyan started to talk about nationality rights in non-territorial terms, rights of Armenians in Moscow and so on. And I just wondered whether within that you found any reference, say, to the earlier works of the Austro-Marxists, or indeed reference to prior nationality debates, whether that was rooted in anything. And to Alex, I mean, it's pretty much the same question that Tim asked, but I was thinking a bit more specifically in terms of the three Baltic states, and I wondered to what extent that emphasis on indigenization was particular to Lithuania context there, because I mean, I guess in the Lithuanian case, you can talk about de facto indigenization after the war, whereas in the other two basically
I tried to be very telegraphic. I very enjoyed all presentations. I just have a few questions. One is for Igor. I very appreciated the geography of the famine in 1946, which is actually emphasizing the Moldovan dimension in this phenomenon. I was just curious when related with some of the phenomena related to the famine. How much was it an urban phenomenon? Even because we have a difference with the 1930s in terms of, for example, permission to abandon the countryside for peasants, or even to cultivate your own piece of land. I mean, the difference with the 30s are quite evident. So what are the political responsibilities for the Moldovan family in order to speak or claim about a Moldovan Holodomor or genocide? Then I had other questions, but maybe we can discuss later. I was also very fascinated by Pietro presentation, and yes, I just wanted to follow also Tim's line about we are in the middle of Gorlization, and as far as Mikoyan is appealing to Armenians even out of the Republic. My question, how was this process perceived in Nagorno-Karabakh or by the diaspora or even in Moscow? And how much are we in front of an Armenian acceptance? But this was already maybe framed as a question. And why did this process again fail? Why did the process for a new constitution fail?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we want to now set of questions and then we'll go another round. So shall we answer them in order of presentation? So if Igor, do you want to start first?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Ricardo. Urban-rural differences in the famine, and according to the main three indicators of the famine. At the level of the Soviet Union, actually, there are more excess deaths in the post-war famine in the urban area than in the famine of the 30s. I don't know yet. This is on my research agenda. How what is the urban-rural differences in Moldova specifically, but I can tell you from other information. For instance, the cannibalism cases. I have a list of them. Yes, so the list of the perpetrators, the list of the victims, the ethnicity, and from this list you can see that cannibalism as one of the main indicators, hard indicators of famine, was only rural phenomenon. Yes, it's a sensitive issue, but we don't have Russians there, we don't have Jews there, we have everything except Russian and Jews. We have ethnic Romanians, we have Gagauz, we have Bulgarians, we have Gypsies, we have other nationalities. So according to this variable of the famine, it was exceptionally a rural phenomenon. So it remains to estimate or to calculate or to find the data that would tell us the proportion in this sense. Genocide issue, I was fond of it actually in the beginning when I was in Stanford. I started with this Holodomor, and I told you, when you look at the map, you have it's not working. Yes, you're looking at the map, the northern counties, which are 90% ethnic Romanians. Yes, and you see the difference. Yes, so it's not working, the genocide, the Holodomor, let's say, argument. But there is the ethnic component. The Gagauz, but it's kind of conflation of climate factors. And another variable is collectivization. If you look at the collectivization rate during the famine, you will see that in the south we have several districts in which collectivization is going from 3–5% up to 70–80%. And these are districts in which vineyards are the main part of the local economy. But in some of them that are not vineyards, so it's difficult to say at the moment. But for sure, the Holodomor thesis is too simplistic, and I think for the 30s as well, some reserves. So we should embark on more sophisticated approaches to look for more causes of the famine.
Yes, I'll try and answer David and Tim's points together because they're interlinked. The first point I would say is really 2 points I want to make. The first point is that, of course, Suslov is not an innovator. He's extremely cautious throughout his political career, and he's not going to sort of invent ideological innovation on the hoof. And there is, and this, without getting into Mike Lohrer's paper, there is a dichotomy here between Suslov as a promoter of Korenizatsiya in the 40s and the account that we read later on that he's against Ukrainian nationalism and against expressions of nationalism and the leaders in the National Republic. So there's an anomaly there which is yet to be fully worked out. So I think he is following the general line. To answer Tim's point, I think that there is an aspect to this that is the general line of the party's time. However, I think there is enough evidence to say there's also a local dynamic, which I tried to allude to in the paper. Lack of time, obviously, doesn't allow me to detail all of it. But the short version is that there's some evidence to say that the NKVD and MVD and Beria wanted a more coercive approach, and there were some intrigues that suggest they were looking at getting rid of Snechkus and Suslov as well in order to get their way. And Suslov and Snechkus on the ground appear to form an alliance actually to protect themselves from this and double down on the line of politics and cultural policy and economic aid support. Partly, I suspect, to protect themselves, but partly because perhaps they felt there was a danger that if we're not standing there, then the MVD will just, they'll deport everybody, and it'll just only get worse. The violence will only increase. So I think there's a local dynamic at play as well as a general line that answers the question. And ironically, it's that coincidence of nationality policy and actually counterinsurgency. What they're effectively saying is that violence alone won't do it. We need to follow all of these channels, and if we're going to have any chance of stabilizing territory. But of course, they're also saving themselves in the process.
Yeah, I think that first of all, when we talk about Korenizatsiya, it's not just a matter of can you put the Communist Manifesto in the Armenian language or something like this. It's also a matter of what can you publish, what can you discuss, what can you talk about. So Mikoyan in the speech was not only talking about rehabilitating Charents, and this is interesting too, because this is not, we're not talking about necessarily a legal process alone. This is a public pronouncement calling for the rehabilitation of a former enemy of the people. And this is the first time since 1937 he's said this, but also he calls for the republication of the works of Rafi, Patkanyan. These were writers who were censored in the Stalin times, who could not publish the works of Rafi and Patkanyan in the Stalin period, especially in Armenia in the late 1930s. So Korenizatsiya is not just a matter of kind of indigenizing, necessarily the Communist Party, but also giving concessions, significant concessions to national culture, national expression, expanding space for what you can and cannot say. And what's also interesting too, I think this actually kind of goes to your point, Ricardo, if you don't mind me kind of segueing to you really quick, that the Armenian response to this, not only Mikoyan's speech, but also first, it's important to keep in mind how widespread was the speech. What was the awareness of it? If you have 100,000 copies, and that's actually what the tirage was, it was 100,000 copies published throughout the Soviet Union, that's pretty significant. But it's also a matter, when we talk about the Armenian response, many Armenians in diaspora actually heard about the speech. The word of the speech got out to the diaspora. So already, like in the 50s, you would read Armenian diaspora publications. They're discussing the speech and the significance of it. And domestically within Armenia, if you look at, I mean, within Soviet Armenia, if you look especially at the reaction to Khrushchev's speech, the Armenian reaction to that speech in 1956 was almost immediate. The effort of Armenians to expand the bounds of what was acceptable in terms of national culture actually came before many other republics, as far as I can tell, because I've been reading works on other republics during the thaw, but they were pushing for already in March 1956, Armenian youth were calling for Stalin's body to be removed from the mausoleum. They were already calling for dismissal of the Stalinist bureaucracy. They were calling for, even at this period, the unification of Karabakh with Armenia. This issue comes up periodically. Also, they were calling for official condemnation of the Istanbul pogrom in 1955. So already this speech is kind of expanding the bounds of what Armenians can say and do, and already to kind of push the boundaries. Even so far that some students at Yerevan State were saying, well, how democratic is Soviet democracy when 99% of the vote goes to the Bolshevik party? They were even talking like this in March 1956. So there is a really kind of a strong kind of response, and this does kind of open up the space for what you can and can't do. And again, it's not necessarily, we're not talking about just indigenizing the communist ideals in the Communist Party, but we're also talking about the expansion of what you can and cannot say, what you can and cannot do. This is another big difference in terms of how we move forward with the nationality policy ideas. And again, those ideas that he articulates in the 54 speech inform what he does with the party program, and then what he does later on with the constitutional reform. As to these debates about the Austro-Marxists that you were talking about, I did not detect that, but I did find something very interesting, which is when he's meeting with the juristi, when he's meeting with the legal experts, Mikoyan, they're talking about already there's a debate supposedly within the Soviet leadership in the 50s about what kind of nationality policy should we pursue. Slianie or slibizhenie, this idea, should we do a merger of nations or rapprochement? And one of the legal experts, who happened to be Armenian, Zamerian, basically said, well, we now know that rapprochement, slibizhenia, decisively won and defeated Slianie. That's how he was talking about this. So the idea being that just kind of a live and let live mentality, that yes, we should not force these countries to be, but it was interesting how they also felt at this time to articulate something. This actually gets to the point of articulation. It's not just implementing a series of policies haphazard to enhance your power base. It's also a matter of what is our raison d'etre, what is our objective here? And that's when we talk about nationality policy, we're talking about an objective. We're talking about what are you trying to pursue with this? And was there anything else? Any other points?
Yoram, did you have anything?
No, I mean, I don't have anything in direct response, but just a kind of reflection actually on your paper, Pietro, that we did find quite a lot of criticism of the cult of personality well before 1956.
Yeah.
But it was of local dictators. That's the point. You have these local dictators who were seen as
local Stalins.
they were local. Well,
Stalins.
yes, you could call them local Stalins.
Moshe Lewin.
He talked about that's right.
Local Stalins.
Yes.
Local Stalins, I think.
Yeah, we did. Actually, I remember talking to him about it. But but that's you have in the regions and the republics attacks on, and that was permissible. And this is on the basis of a lot of kind of pent up feeling that had been building up over a number of years, and that was way before 1956.
Yeah, no, definitely. And actually, I just want to kind of jump on that. That actually the cult of personality term originates with Malenkov in 1953, so just shortly after Stalin's death. So already they're talking about these ideas. Because when I found this in the archives in Armenia, I was wondering how unique is this? I mean, how compared to what was going on in the country as a whole.
Yeah. I think Malenkov is almost on the first meeting with the started like in March. Natasha.
Thank you all for very fascinating papers. inspirational. I had a question for Alex, but you've answered it very lucidly already. I just find it poetic that kind of Suslov teamed up with Snitch against Beria using almost the same sort of, policy strategy rhetoric that Beria himself will try to use several years later. I was listening to Pietro, your talk, and listening and I was thinking, Mr. Can, I know Mr. Can.
Yes, of course. Well, yes, yes.
He's Nisnikov, actually.
Yes.
He was for a year, but he was the first chairman of the Belarusian Communist
Mhm.
Party in
Mhm.
1989, before he moved on to Armenia. But I was also, struck by this attack or crossing out of Sliania in favor of Zbliżenia, because I was trying to find this in 1965 in the context of Belarus and the discussions by Pietro, as you mentioned earlier, Belarusian Party Secretary for Culture, briefing the party on the new cultural shifts, and he was also reassuring, it felt like through his rhetoric, he was reassuring his audience that nobody's really talking about the merger of nationalities. We're talking about something in a bit more sophisticated, less threatening. So it's interesting to see that that was not allowed for some kind of invasion of Belarus, known as rebellious politicians, but actually there were precedents, even while Khrushchev was around, and not just in the party program. And I guess that leaves me with a question for Yoram. So what drove this idea of socialist legality so securely that by 1956 and beyond, Khrushchev came and kept his own with the anti-Russian? Is it Khrushchev himself, or is there other drivers that stretch this and the courts are so pushing back?
I have a question for Igor and what we will. Igor, concerning the Famine as well as the 49 deportation, the so-called Operation South, I was always struck that it's not too bigger, importantly, in national identity building. And I wanted to ask you, is that the case, or do you think it will someday play a similar role like the Holodomor in Ukraine? And why don't we know so more about it? Yes, because I think even among historians, you normally deal with the overall famine and then with Ukraine, and in German historiography maybe now with Kazakhstan and Moldova shows so much at the margin. Sorry that I'm asking you, do you have an idea of why this is the case? And to Yoram, I like very much the idea about his turnover in 61 because of Khrushchev realizes everybody was lying to him. I wanted to ask, does he realize how much he's destroying his own power base? And if not, do you think this is his personal failure or more structural?
So we'll take one more, Jeremy.
Oh, okay. I mean, my questions were kind of covered by Tim and Ricardo, but I'm not sure you answered Ricardo's question. I'd like to get you a bit more about what we call the constitutional reform and whether it really made a difference. I mean, throughout time, I've got some issues with how you characterize bureaucracy a bit, but actually you have to discuss that later, because that'll take a while, I think.
Thank you. So if we answer as briefly as possible, we might have another 2 more questions afterwards. So again, going order of
Yeah, Susan, it's a great question, actually. Difficult, but I will be as brief as I can. I think we should try to be balanced in explaining, not sticking to the ethnic issue, to the let's say research agenda of the famine of the 30s. We should be open to different factors. As I told you, there is not a clear ethnic factor intentional. Yes, this is the main issue of the genocide definition. Yes, to have an intention to kill specific ethnic groups. Yes. So it seems there is no evidence here, but there is a issue with the whole Bessarabia. Yes. So probably I cannot say it at this moment, but something is there against the whole Bessarabian population as a former territory of a Nazi ally, something like that. So it could be that the intention was to make these people to suffer more than others, but what really happened is that you don't have this kind of ethnic. You have because of this combination of climate and all this stuff. Others are suffering more than others, and not specifically the majority titular nationality Romanians, which were perceived more like pro-Romanian, and so on and so on and so on. So I'll try to do this job as honest as possible. And for the Holodomor, for the genocide, let others on the risk and Soviet ethnicize that, vulgarize, simplify. Because the same story is with Holodomor, inside Ukraine, there is a message that basically this is Holodomor. The same scholars going abroad saying actually it was not Holodomor, including Kuchitsky. So it's a very, very kind of delicate kind of story in the Ukrainian case as well. Yes, and the last thing is that recently our parliament, the ruling party, passed a law on making the post-war famine as organized. So this is a way of saying it was intentional. Yes, and I or other professional historians were not consulted at all, even though I'm very close to it. So it's kind of parallel. I think that would go politically, but we should do our job as honest as possible. Thank you.
I think it goes to me. I have but so Ricardo, what was your question again about the Constitution and its fate? I think that there was like, did it succeed or something? It just was. It wasn't adopted in the end. I mean, all we have is just kind of these ideas that were kind of, articulated, and they came down to like developing a framework, but nothing was ever adopted in the end. And what you actually ended up having was there was the Brezhnev Constitution later on, where a watered down version of this was adopted, but nothing to the degree that was envisioned in the early 1960s. Although I should also note that another point that I think should have been addressed, because there were some things that were not addressed in these constitutional reforms or these proposed constitutional reforms. They did not really discuss so much, for example, non-titular nationalities. They also did not touch on this issue of territoriality, right? So this is another kind of problem I noticed, that this is what Mikoyan talks about in terms of the party program. And in fact, not only does he scratch out the term, but all his recommendations, virtually all his recommendations, are accepted in the final version of the party program. And he's actually backed up also by Kusinin. So this is another person who's also kind of supporting the same kind of line Mikoyan is, but he's kind of backing Mikoyan up. Mikoyan is actually the first person to advance these. You've written about this, Alex. So unfortunately, it does not, I mean, we wonder as like a counterfactual, what if it had been realized? What if the Soviet Union became more of like I guess a confederation or a union of states? Would there have been different outcomes? I mean, this is an interesting question. Yes, the new Union Treaty is the most, probably it's the closest thing. But actually, there's one more thing I wanted to say. I talked to Sasha Simonov of Higher School of Economics about this, and he was telling me basically that, was this kind of similar, again, like you said, to the new Union Treaty? Was this also tied in with kind of defeating reform politically?
Okay, thanks. Yoram.
Yeah, so what drives socialist legality? contemporaries in the mid-1950s believed that socialist legality was a new term and a new kind of campaign, but in fact it went back to the 1930s. It had two meanings. The first meaning was entirely new and could not have been used under Stalin, and that was to do with the impermissibility of extrajudicial repression, and that's actually the first person to use that is Beria, but everyone signs up to that. That is completely new. The other meaning goes back probably to the late 1940s, and that's used by lawyers, and that is grounded, strangely enough, in the Constitution, and that's how they justify it. In the late 1940s, it's a bit surprising. They carry on justifying it in the right through the 1950s and early 1960s, and it leads to consequences, which I won't describe in the book. Susanna, great question. I think that the first thing to say is that earlier commentators believed that Khrushchev's power base rested on him appointing people who are part of his kind of network. And we argue against that. That's not really, what matters is not whether they're close to Khrushchev, but whether they're doing their job properly. Because what they really need to do is to win over the support of local population and to gain the support of local elites. That is what he's really interested in. In terms of what happened in 1961, the Ryazan affair is just an absolute humiliation for Khrushchev. And Polyansky at a presidium meeting says, there was no 150,000 tons. We only had 60,000 tons. It's all a lie. And that really undermines his position. The third thing I'll just say about it is that what Khrushchev does, you have expulsion. This is something that runs right through, but what he does is to detoxify it, to remove the kind of emotional charge, and to remove its association with violence. So when these people are removed, he makes it very clear to them, you've earned our support, don't you worry. You're not only will you not be executed, you won't be expelled from the party, you won't even be removed from nomenclatura, but I am asking you to, I'm telling you that you are fired.
So we have a question, two more very brief questions, a very brief answer. So,
yeah, thank you all. Yoram, please, you mentioned Scholitz, you haven't mentioned Graham Gill's work on collective leadership in Soviet politics. Are you familiar with that?
Sorry, who?
Graham Gill.
Graham Gill, yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you relate your findings or your conclusions to this category, to this typology between patrons, clients, and allies? It's my.
Yeah, sorry.
The question is for Alex. As a biographer, to what extent do you think that this moment might have been formative for Suslov, a la like Andropov 1956? I know in the Ukrainian case, those who survived Stalinist purges ended up getting thrown out of the fryer into the frying pan for language reasons. They get sent out west to implement Jan Gross's revolution from abroad, and they are completely ill-equipped to deal with the situation, and a lot of their decision-making seems rather fear-driven. So I'm wondering how much this episode sticks with Suslov.
Thank you. Yoram, would you want to answer as well? Alex,
Perhaps Alex should
have to
ask
think
first.
about it, or you have to go?
Oh, sorry, that order. Yes. Yeah. Well, let me answer first.
Yes, sure.
Yes. Is it formative for Suslov himself? In a way, it's all formative, but one of the problems for Suslov is he doesn't really change. At age about 20, he's the same. His son, apparently, Revoli said, he was interviewed in 2020. His son was interviewed in 2020 about rumors, for example, that Suslov was the secret head of the Russian party in the CPSU, and his son said, "No, my dad was a Bolshevik. That was all he was. There's nothing else going on there. He's just a Bolshevik." So in another paper, I made the case that really it's the Komsomol. Suslov's activity in the Komsomol in the 20s is really what shapes him. Now, with that all said, I think getting promoted to Moscow and then getting the kind of jobs that he had in Moscow, heading the international department, made Suslov thereafter indispensable in a strange kind of way. So it was very good for him in that sense. Getting into the international department in 1946 gave him, put him in charge of all these international connections. He was then very quickly involved in Common Forum. He sort of was the second man to Zhdanov. And that was really where the rest of Suslov's career was made. It was a combination of cultural policing, art and culture, and dealing with foreign communist parties. So I think it was, in a sense, it was the immediate prelude to that step. It was formative, but I don't think it changed Suslov himself. I think Suslov is a pretty straight down the line communist. He's not a complex schizophrenic personality. He's a Bolshevik from about the age of 20 onwards. And in that sense, his sort of puritanical characteristics, the fact that he wasn't interested in personal wealth, apparently, that he was never apparently corrupt or never obviously corrupt, that he never had mistresses. He was just a communist. And you can see it in his earliest writings, whose role models are Lenin and Stalin, and really that for him set the path for the rest of his life.
Yes, so very briefly, patron-client relations, clientelism, as opposed to coalitions and alliances. We move away from clientelism and patron-client relations. As a term, it was very widely used in the 60s and early 70s. For various reasons, there's a preference now for networks, partly because clientelism has a sort of ethnocentric kind of aspect to it, and sometimes it's associated with the states of Southern Europe and so on. And networks are in some ways a slightly more neutral and generalizable term. What we argue is that actually, in terms of Gill's approach, that clientelism isn't really the best way of looking at it, that the center is very interested in competence, the competence of regional leaders. If they want to make use of patronage, clientelism, the creation of what we call trust networks, then that's fine. But we cut across those sets of categories.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if Michael wants to break his own rules and.
I couldn't possibly proceed.
Right, okay, that's fine. Just a round of applause for wonderful papers.
Break time. Yeah. 5 o'clock.